February 14, 1779. Kealakekua Bay on the island of Hawaii. On this sacred shoreline, a scene of chaos erupts. A British sea captain, a man once hailed as a living god, now stumbles into the surf, clubbed from behind and stabbed with an iron dagger. This is the death of Captain James Cook, the greatest European navigator of his age. But this was more than the death of one man. It was the violent collision of two worlds, a clash born from prophecy and misunderstanding, from reverence and rage. How did it come to this? How did a relationship that began with worship end in bloodshed and a bitter, contested legacy that echoes to this day? By 1776, Captain James Cook was a titan of the Age of Enlightenment. A man of humble origins, he had risen through sheer merit to become the preeminent explorer of his time. His first two epic voyages had redrawn the map of the world, charting thousands of miles of coastline in Australia and New Zealand, and finally dispelling the myth of a great southern continent, the fabled Terra Australis Incognita. Now, he was summoned from a comfortable retirement for a third, final, and secret mission. The official purpose was to return a young Raiatean man named Omai to his homeland. But the true objective, concealed in orders to be opened only at sea, was to solve the greatest remaining puzzle of global geography, the search for the Northwest Passage. For centuries, European powers had dreamed of a northern sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, a shortcut to the riches of Asia. Cook's task was to find its western entrance somewhere along the uncharted coast of North America. Half a world away, unknown to the empires of Europe, lay a society that had developed in isolation for over 1,000 years. The Hawaiian Islands were a complex Polynesian chiefdom, a world governed not by kings and parliaments, but by a rigid spiritual and social order. At its heart was the concept of kapu, a system of sacred laws and prohibitions that dictated every aspect of life, from what foods could be eaten to how one behaved in the presence of a chief. Breaking kapu could mean death, as it threatened the spiritual balance, the mana, that held their universe together. Hawaiian society was a strict hierarchy. At its apex were the ali, the ruling chiefs, who were considered descendants of the gods. Below them were the kahuna, the priests and master craftsmen who held the keys to sacred rituals. And forming the base of the pyramid were the maka'ainana, the common people who worked the land and sea. This order was maintained through the worship of four great gods, or akua. There was Kane, the creator, Ku, the god of war, and Kanaloa, god of the ocean, and then there was Lono, the god of fertility, rain, agriculture, and peace. Each year, the Hawaiian people celebrated the Makahiki, a 4-month festival honoring Lono's return to the islands. It was a sacred time of peace and renewal. All warfare was forbidden. The people made offerings, or hukupu, to the chiefs and celebrated with feasts, games, and dance. The festival began when the constellation Makalii, or the Pleiades, first appeared in the evening sky, and its central ritual involved a procession carrying an image of Lono, a tall staff with a crosspiece draped in white kapa cloth on a clockwise circuit around the island. The spiritual center of this celebration was a sacred harbor on the Kona coast of the Big Island, Kealakekua Bay, the pathway of the god, a place believed to be Lono's earthly home. On January 17, 1779, as the Makahiki festival reached its peak, two strange objects appeared on the horizon. Cook's ships sailed directly into Kealakekua Bay. For the Hawaiians, the timing and the appearance were no mere miscoincidence. The tall masts and white sails of the British vessels bore an uncanny resemblance to the sacred banner of Lono, arriving at his sacred bay during his sacred festival. Cook's officers estimated that 10,000 people came out to greet them. The Hawaiians prostrated themselves on the ground as Cook came ashore. He was escorted by priests to the great heiau of Lono, where he was draped in sacred red cloth and presented with offerings. They called him Lono. The European narrative would long portray this as the simple misunderstanding of a primitive people. But the reality was far more complex. The arrival of these powerful otherworldly vessels was an event of immense cosmic significance. The Hawaiian priests, the kahuna, were faced with a profound challenge: to interpret this unprecedented arrival and integrate it into their worldview. By identifying Cook as a manifestation of Lono, they were not simply being naive, they were performing a sophisticated act of cultural and political management, seeking to control this powerful new force by defining it within their own sacred terms, a move that could also enhance their own spiritual authority over the ruling chiefs. For a month, a fragile peace held. The Hawaiians lavished the visitors with food and gifts, honoring them as divine guests. The British, in turn, offered displays of their own culture, violin concerts and fireworks that lit up the night sky. But beneath the surface of celebration, tensions were building. Feeding over 180 foreign sailors for weeks placed an enormous strain on the island's resources. Worse, the visitors did not behave like gods. The sailors eagerly traded iron nails, a metal precious to the Hawaiians, for sex, introducing syphilis and gonorrhea to the isolated population. And when a British seaman died of a stroke, it offered undeniable proof that these strangers were in fact mortal. On February 4th, 1779, the ships finally departed. For the Hawaiians, the ritual was complete. The makahiki was over, and Lono had returned to his mythical home. The season of peace gave way to the season of Ku, the god of war and politics. But just 1 week later, a fierce gale snapped the foremast of the Resolution, forcing a crippled return to Kealakekua Bay. This return was a profound and dangerous disruption of the cosmic order. The festival was over. The bay was now under a religious taboo, a kapu. Lono was not supposed to be here. A god would not return with a broken ship. The Hawaiians' perception of Cook shifted dramatically. He was no longer a divine being fulfilling a prophecy, but a powerful and perhaps dangerous mortal who had violated their most sacred traditions. The welcome was gone, replaced with suspicion and defiance. Thefts of iron tools and fittings from the ships became rampant. The British response was swift and, in Hawaiian eyes, sacrilegious. When a chief was caught taking an armorer's tongs, he was publicly flogged, a humiliating punishment for a man of his rank. In another skirmish, a different chief was struck with an oar. To the Hawaiians, where the alii were sacred, these acts were not just punishments. They were profound insults to the entire social and spiritual order, demanding retribution. The final crisis began on the night of February 13th. A group of Hawaiians stole the Discovery's cutter, a vital longboat needed for ferrying men and supplies. Enraged, Captain Cook resorted to a tactic he had used successfully elsewhere in the Pacific. He would go ashore and take the island's paramount chief, Kalaniopuu, hostage until the boat was returned. It was a fatal miscalculation. Cook failed to understand that in Hawaii, the alii Nu was a living god. To lay hands on him was the ultimate violation of kapu, an act of sacrilege that could only be answered with blood. At dawn on February 14th, Cook landed with a party of armed Marines and marched to the chief's residence. Kalani'opu'u, old and frail, initially agreed to accompany Cook, but as they neared the beach, his wives and other chiefs pleaded with him, realizing the Englishman's intent. A large, agitated crowd quickly gathered, armed with daggers and stones. Suddenly, a canoe paddled frantically towards the shore. A messenger shouted that another chief had been shot and killed by the British sailors blockading the bay. The crowd's anxiety turned to fury. Kalani'opu'u sat down, refusing to move. The warriors surged forward, surrounding the small band of Marines. A man threatened Cook, who fired his musket, first with birdshot, then with a ball, killing a warrior. The Marines fired a volley, but it was too late. They were overwhelmed.
The reaction from the British crew was one of horrified disbelief, which quickly turned to brutal revenge. For days, they fired their cannons into the villages along the bay, burning homes and killing indiscriminately. They demanded the return of Cook's body, not understanding the ritual that was taking place. The Hawaiians, far from cannibalizing their foe, as European myths would later claim, were honoring him. As they would for their own highest chiefs, they dismembered his body, baking the flesh from the bones to preserve them. The bones of a great man held immense mana, or spiritual power, and were to be kept as sacred relics. After days of negotiation, some of Cook's remains were returned and buried at sea with full military honors. But Cook's death was not an end, it was a violent beginning. A young chief who witnessed these events, Kamehameha, saw the terrifying power of European firearms. Over the next decade, he shrewdly traded for muskets and cannons and enlisted foreign advisors to train his army. In 1795, he unleashed this new military machine, brutally conquering and uniting the Hawaiian Islands for the first time, forging a new kingdom from the crucible of war. The weapons Cook's expedition introduced were not the only change. The diseases his sailors carried, syphilis, tuberculosis, measles, swept through the immunologically defenseless population. Over the next century, the native Hawaiian population would collapse, falling by as much as 90%. This demographic catastrophe left Kamehameha's new kingdom vulnerable to the waves of missionaries, merchants, and planters who followed. The path that began at Kealakekua Bay ended in 1893 with the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy by American business interests. Today, James Cook's legacy is one of profound and painful duality. He was a brilliant navigator who vastly expanded the European map of the world. But for the indigenous people of the Pacific, he was the leading edge of the fatal impact, the agent of an empire whose arrival heralded an age of disease, dispossession, and colonization. The battle on the beach at Kealakekua Bay was not just the tragic end of one man's final voyage, it was the moment that irrevocably and violently thrust the Hawaiian people into the modern world.